It started on a Tuesday, a terse email from HR. Please come to the conference room. The message was a cold shard of digital ice in an otherwise normal morning, a morning I had begun with the mundane optimism of brewed coffee and a cleared inbox. I walked in, and my entire team was there, including my boss, David. The air was ice. It was a palpable weight, a vacuum that had sucked all the warmth and casual banter from the room, leaving only a sterile, antiseptic silence. David, a man who had once slapped me on the back over a round of beers and told me I was family, a man whose children's names I knew, whose vacation photos I had politely admired, couldn't even look me in the eye. His gaze was fixed on the polished mahogany of the conference table as if he could divine some escape route in the wood grain. A woman from HR I'd never met, a woman with a severe bun and a suit the color of a storm cloud, slid a folder across the table. Her movements were economical, robotic. Your position has been made redundant, she said, her voice devoid of any human warmth, a flatline of corporate speech. We need you to clear your desk immediately. Redundant, the word echoed in the silent chamber of my skull, bouncing off the walls of my disbelief. It was a clinical, dismissive term that sought to erase not just my job, but my contributions, my late nights, my very presence. I'd just closed the quarter's biggest deal, a grueling 6-month negotiation that had secured a multi-million-dollar client who had been on the fence for years. I'd personally built the automated reporting system that saved the department hundreds of thousands in man-hours and operational waste. I had metrics, accolades, the data to prove my worth. And yet here I was, being dismissed with a single soulless word. I looked at David, my voice quiet, a fragile thing threatening to crack. Why? It was the only word I could muster, a plea for a reason, for a shred of logic in this sudden, violent upheaval. He finally met my gaze, and it was filled with a pity so sharp it felt like a physical cut. It wasn't sympathy, it was the condescending pity one might show a wounded animal moments before it's put down. It's just business, Mark, nothing personal. Those words, it's just business, are the battle cry of cowards. They are the carefully crafted lie people in power tell to absolve themselves of guilt, to sanitize the brutality of their decisions, to pretend that tearing apart a person's livelihood is a simple arithmetic equation and not an act of profound violence. They fired me, had a security guard with a bored expression escort me out of the building like I was a criminal, my personal effects dumped into a cardboard box that felt like a coffin for my career. They watched me go from the glass windows of the office, and I am sure they thought that was the end of the story. They had a meeting to get to, projections to discuss. They had no idea, not even a flicker of a notion, that for me, it was only the beginning. The rage was a living thing inside me for days, a coiled serpent in my gut that fed on the bitter gruel of my humiliation. It was a cold, dark knot that tightened with every remembered glance, every hollow echo of those final words. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the night was a canvas upon which my mind would project the entire scene in excruciating, high-definition detail, the feel of the folder, the chill in the room, the averted eyes of my colleagues. I couldn't think. The humiliation was a constant, screaming soundtrack in my mind, drowning out all rational thought, all plans for the future. My wife Sarah tried to reach me, her voice a distant bell through a thick fog. "We'll be okay, Mark, we'll get through this." But her words, though loving, couldn't penetrate the fortress of my shame and anger. I was adrift in a sea of what-ifs and why-not-thems, my self-worth shattered on the rocks of corporate indifference. But then, one sleepless night, as the digital clock glowed 3:17 a.m., I forced myself to get up, to do something. The aimless packing was driving me mad. I sat at my home desk, the stark light of the monitor illuminating my haggard face, and began the soul-crushing task of updating my resume. It felt like writing my own obituary. As I was digging through a drawer of old files for a certificate of completion from a forgotten seminar, my fingers brushed against a thick, cardboard folder I'd forgotten about entirely. It was tucked behind a stack of old tax returns, a relic from a simpler time. On its tab, in my late aunt's elegant cursive, were the words, "Oakwood Drive Property." The memory flooded back, a gentle wave amidst the turmoil. 5 years ago, my wife and I had inherited a modest but well-maintained duplex from this kind, distant relative. It was a surprise, a small windfall we had never anticipated. At the time, we were both deep in our careers, and the prospect of being hands-on landlords held no appeal. We'd immediately hired a property management company, Premier Properties, to handle everything, finding tenants, collecting the rent, dealing with the minor repairs and complaints. The checks arrived like clockwork every month, a quiet, passive stream of income. The tenants, as per the company's reports, were always vetted and quiet. I rarely thought about it. It was just a line item in our budget, a footnote in our financial life. We were absentee owners in the truest sense. Out of sheer morbid curiosity, a desperate need to focus on anything other than my own catastrophic failure, I logged into the Premier Properties portal. My password was autofilled, a ghost of a past transaction. The interface was bland and bureaucratic. I navigated to the tenant list for the Oakwood duplex. Unit A, a young couple, the Fosters, lease renewed for another year. Unit B, a corporate lease. My eyes, bleary from lack of sleep, scanned the line. The corporate lease was held by none other than Next Gen Dynamics. My company, or rather my former company, my heart, which had been beating a dull, lethargic rhythm, suddenly kicked into a frantic, pounding gallop. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the screen, and the point of contact for the lease, the authorized signatory, David Miller, my former boss. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ambient sounds of my house, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock, faded into an immense, profound silence. A slow, cold smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks. It was not a smile of joy, but of revelation. The chaotic, seething rage didn't disappear, it transformed. It crystallized, molecule by molecule, into a sharp, focused, and utterly patient purpose. It was no longer a blind emotion, it was a strategy. "It's just business," he had said. The words echoed in my mind, but now they were not a taunt, they were a blueprint. "Oh, David," I thought, the smile tightening. Now it was about to be. The following morning, the fog of despair had lifted, replaced by a clear, cold clarity. I immediately drafted an email to Premier Properties, terminating their contract. I cited a desire for personal oversight and a more hands-on approach to our asset management. I was polite, firm, and gave them the 30 days notice required. There was a perfunctory call from my account manager, a young man named Kyle who sounded vaguely disappointed, but he processed the termination without a fight. I was now the landlord. The first official act in my new role was to schedule a routine property inspection. I knew this was my opening move, my first chance to shift the balance of power. The day of the inspection, I dressed with a care I hadn't mustered in weeks. I put on my best suit, the same charcoal gray one I'd worn for my final, failed performance review with David. The fabric felt like armor. As I drove to Oakwood Drive, my hands were steady on the wheel. The duplex was exactly as I remembered it from the photos. A neat, brick-faced building with a small, well-kept lawn. It looked like a home. I parked on the street, took a deep breath, and walked to the door of Unit B. I rang the bell. The seconds stretched out. Then the door opened, and there he was, David Miller, in faded jeans and a rumpled t-shirt, holding a coffee mug that said "World's Best Dad." The look on his face when he saw me standing there was priceless, a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. It was a car crash of emotions. First, simple confusion at the unfamiliar face in a suit, then the dawning, slow-motion recognition as his brain connected the dots, and finally, the unmistakable sliver of fear that darkened his eyes. "Mark, what are you doing here?" His voice was a mixture of surprise and a forced, brittle cordiality. "I'm the landlord, David," I said, my voice calm and pleasant, the model of professional courtesy. "Just here to check on my property." I stepped forward, a subtle but undeniable movement that forced him to give way. I walked past him into the home he shared with his wife and 2 children. The air smelled of bacon and cleaning products. I saw the family photos on the mantelpiece, smiling faces at Disneyland, a graduation portrait. I saw toys scattered in a corner, a small, pink bicycle leaning against the wall in the hallway. I made a show of being the diligent landlord. I tested the faucets in the kitchen, noting the water pressure. I peered at the windows, checking the seals. I opened and closed the dishwasher. I was professional, courteous, and I knew I was utterly terrifying to him. He followed me from room to room like a lost puppy, his confidence, the very aura of corporate authority he always carried, completely shattered. He tried to make small talk, to bridge the terrifying chasm that had opened between us. "Look, Mark, about what happened at the office. It was a tough decision from the top, you know how it is." I cut him off with a raised hand, not even looking at him as I inspected a minor crack in the bathroom tile. "This isn't about the office, David," I said, my voice even. "This is just business." I saw him flinch, a full-body recoil as if I'd struck him. His own words, the shield he had used, had now been turned into the sharpest of swords. He was silent for the rest of the inspection. I finished my notes, gave him a curt nod. "Everything seems to be in acceptable order. You'll receive a formal report. Good day." I left him standing in his own doorway, a man suddenly made a stranger in his own home. I let a month pass. The silence, I was sure, was its own form of psychological torture for him. Every ring of the phone, every knock at the door would have set his nerves on edge. I used this time wisely. I consulted with a real estate attorney, not about the legality of what I was planning. I already knew the lease agreement, which I had studied like a sacred text, gave me broad authority, but to ensure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. I wanted no procedural errors, no loopholes he could exploit. My vengeance required the cold, unimpeachable legitimacy of the law. Then I enacted Phase 2. I sent him, via certified mail, an official 30-day notice of a significant rent increase. I didn't just raise it, I tripled it. It was a punitive, impossible amount, a figure designed not to generate income, but to send a message. It was an economic eviction notice. I knew he couldn't pay it out of his own pocket. I also knew, from my intimate knowledge of NextGen's internal policies, that the company would never approve such an exorbitant increase for a mid-level manager's housing allowance. It was a perfect trap. The call came within 2 days. His voice on the other end of the line was sputtering, cracking with a panic that was music to my ears. "Mark this. This is outrageous. You can't do this. This isn't just an increase, it's extortion." "I absolutely can, David," I replied, my voice cool and detached, as if I were explaining a basic mathematical principle. "The market rate in that neighborhood has skyrocketed. A comparative market analysis supports this new figure. It's all clearly outlined in Clause 7B of the standard residential lease agreement you signed with Premier Properties. I'm simply maximizing my assets' value in a dynamic market." I paused, letting the corporate jargon sink in. "It's just business." He tried to fight. He went over my head, calling the county clerk's office, trying to find some kind of rent control ordinance he could use. He even tried to contact the previous owners, my long-deceased aunt's estate, desperate to find another authority, another real owner to appeal to. Everywhere he turned, he ran into the brick wall of my name on the deed. I was the sole authority. I was the law. The realization that he was utterly trapped, that the man he had so casually discarded now held absolute power over the roof over his family's head, must have been a terrifying poison seeping into his daily life. The hunter had become the prey. The final act was the most satisfying, not for its spectacle, but for its quiet, judicial finality. When he inevitably failed to pay the new rent, I began the formal, legal eviction process. I filed the paperwork myself, my handwriting neat and precise. The court date was swift, a mere formality in the face of the uncontested facts. I represented myself. He stood before the judge, his wife sitting nervously in the gallery behind him, and he tried to argue that this was a personal vendetta, that I was retaliating for being fired. The judge, a weary-looking woman with lines of experience etched on her face and no patience for corporate drama, listened for a moment before looking over the paperwork. She adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting through his emotional plea, "the lease agreement is clear. The landlord is within his rights to adjust the rent upon renewal, provided proper notice is given. The notice was given, you have failed to pay. The law is not concerned with your interpersonal conflicts. The eviction is granted." The gavel fell with a sound like the slamming of a tomb door. I was there a week later, when the sheriff's deputy oversaw the removal of their belongings from my property. It was a bright, sunny day, cruelly cheerful. David's wife was crying, silent tears of shame and disbelief streaking her face. His children, a boy and a girl, looked confused and scared, clutching stuffed animals as they watched movers carry their furniture out to a rented truck. He stood on the lawn, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, a man hollowed out. He finally looked at me, all the fight gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, devastating understanding. He had played the game of just business and had lost everything. He walked over, his steps heavy. His voice was a broken whisper, meant only for me. Was it worth it? Destroying my family like this, making my children homeless? Was this your pound of flesh, Mark? I looked at him, then at the house that was no longer his home, then back at him. There was no joy in this moment, not the kind of triumphant glee I had once fantasized about. There was only a profound, silent sense of balance. The scales, which he had so arrogantly tipped, were now even. A terrible, costly equilibrium had been restored. I didn't destroy your family, David, I said, my voice quiet but firm, carrying a weight that seemed to still the air around us. You did. The day you decided my livelihood, my family's security, was disposable. The day you hid behind a phrase to avoid taking responsibility for your actions. You made it personal the moment you treated me as a number and not a person. I just made it real. I held his gaze for a moment longer, letting him see the absolute, unyielding conviction in my eyes. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I left him standing there in the wreckage of the life he had built on the assumption that some people simply don't matter, that they can be used and discarded without consequence. The invisible man had become the judge, the jury, and the landlord. And justice, for once, was not blind. It was perfectly, exquisitely, and ruthlessly clear.